Hello on a sunny Tuesday afternoon for a video about Unit 3 Aerostate 2, and in my case this is Aerostate 2a, about domestic macroeconomic goals. We're going to be looking at structuring answers for aggregate demand and aggregate supply based questions, as well as the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. We're going to look at three sample questions that I've made up, kind of go into how you go about answering those, like where the marks would come from, and then look at a sample answer that includes all of those things. So first up, we're going to look at some key tips that I've written down this afternoon. So there's a pretty clear set structure to answering AD and AS focused questions, which I'm going to show you on the next two slides after this, that a friend, Alison Billington from another school, has made these really simple templates for that I have now stolen to use, because I would have made the exact same thing, but it would have just been in text and less exciting. So let's give her all the credit. If you know her, tell her she did great work. If you follow these templates, you should not lose any marks. My goal is for you not to lose marks anyway, unless you're in my class, in which case I hate people getting 100%. I hope you get 99, because I'm a jerk. With aggregate demand focused questions, you should always focus on which components of AD are being affected. Sometimes there's more than one. Often we focus on things that only affect private consumption spending, but often there's a twofold effect. Twofold probably bring back nightmares to anyone of you who is currently doing accounting, but there's a twofold effect in most cases, and it's important to talk about both of those. And then, so you've got to talk about how those components are affected by whatever factor is changing, and then whether aggregate demand is changed overall. Then you link that to the overall rate of economic growth or the achievement of the goal. Also very important. If a question asks you about the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, you should always define it. So that's the highest growth rate possible without running into any unnecessary inflationary, environmental, or external pressures, measured at a rate of 3 to 3.5% GDP growth, real GDP growth per annum. With aggregate supply-based questions, you should always focus on either cost of production or efficiency. Sometimes they also say the availability of resources, like you'll see that in the template, but really it boils down to those two things. As long as you can link the factor, the AS factor, with one of those two things, how that's going to affect the business, if that means they're going to supply more or supply less, produce more, produce less, link that to change in aggregate supply, and then the achievement of the goal overall. So let's get into some of these. So Alison's very wonderful template here to show off how to respond to aggregate demand factors. So identify or define the factor. I kind of like to say describe the factor, because you don't always have to explicitly define it. So describe the factor. So if you're describing consumer confidence, how optimistic consumers feel about future income, employment, etc. Provide links to the component of AD affected. So that's when you're going to be talking about, does it affect C, I, G, X, M, or does it affect taxation or savings? Could affect any of those, could affect multiple of those. So you're going to talk about whatever of those it affects, if it affects them positively or negatively, and why. Then you're going to say if aggregate demand increases or decreases, how businesses will respond to that. So if aggregate demand increases, that sends a signal to businesses to increase production in search of greater profits. If AD decreases, this sends a signal to businesses to downsize and reduce production, and therefore supply less overall. Then you link that to economic growth overall. So if it's going to increase or decrease the rate of economic growth. And then if you have statistical evidence available, you should use that. Not going to happen in all of the questions, but if you have evidence available, like if this is under a graph of economic growth at the top, maybe throw some of those data in. If you know the recent data and it's a recent question, use it. It's going to make you sound smart. And add there, if it's about the goals of trying to sustainable economic growth, sometimes you might get a question about how something affects the achievement of the goal, and in which case your last statement is going to be about if we're more likely or less likely to achieve that goal. And for aggregate supply, so once again, identify or describe that AS factor, and then provide links to either the cost of production, availability of resources, or efficiency. I say cost of production and efficiency are the most important. Then identify if the firms are more able or willing to supply, and identify if aggregate supply increases or decreases. Then you mention if that changes our productive capacity, and if real GDP will increase, aka economic growth, and then potentially the achievement of that goal, and provide stats or an example if applicable. In this case, if you get the option of which one to use, I always recommend using education and training, because it's really easy to talk about how that then impacts workers being able to produce more output per unit of input because they're getting more, they're more productive, they're getting more output per hour worked, and therefore that increases our productive capacity and increases our economic growth. So then, for example question, I went for an easy one to start with. Explain the impact of an increase in personal income tax on the rate of economic growth. So if we break this down into 3 marks, so first up, the first mark is going to be describe the change. Looks like 2 letters there. So you're going to say what a change in personal income tax is, what an increase in personal income tax is. 1 mark is then link to components of aggregate demand. So that is going to affect personal income, private consumption spending, and taxation revenue. So link to components of AD. And then 1 mark is then for overall impact on economic growth. So you break down to that. If you do those 3 things, you're going to get all of the marks. So let's look at this. Now, if we look at an increase in personal income tax, would mean that households have decreased levels of disposable and discretionary income as a larger proportion of their income goes towards tax. So that first bunch of sentences, that's your first mark. Then this will lead to a decrease in private consumption spending and an increase in leakages via tax revenue, and this would decrease aggregate demand overall. That's your second mark. This decrease in aggregate demand would send a signal to producers to decrease production overall and lead to a reduction in the rate of economic growth. There's your third mark. Not too complex overall, but really clearly points out where those 3 marks are and is really step-by-step clear following that structure of how to answer that question. Then to move on to another one that is slightly more difficult. Analyze the impact of an appreciation of the exchange rate on the rate of economic growth. Whenever you get a question where it's talking about analyze often means there's multiple impacts. And in a question like this, I'm going to say your multiple impacts are AD and AS. So that's going to have a different impact on each of them, and you're going to need to point out what they are. So 1 mark is going to be coming from describing an appreciation. So describe appreciation exchange rate. To say what that is, means that our dollar is worth more in relation to trading with our trading partners. Then you're going to get 1 mark for how that impacts AD. So once again, looking at your components, how it impacts aggregate demand overall. Then 1 mark for how it impacts aggregate supply. And 1 mark for impacts on economic growth. It's going to be a different impact for each of them. If you're going to do one after this, you'll probably talk about the overall impact. And then after that sentence, you'll probably talk about the overall impact. That's going to make up that last mark. So if we look at the sample answer now, an appreciation in the exchange rate means that the Australian dollar will be valued higher in comparison to our trading partners. So that's that first mark there. So just that first sentence there, that's describing it. That's your first mark overall. A higher exchange rate will lead to an increase in leakages via imports as consumers take advantage of relatively cheaper imports, and a decrease in injections as demand for our exports decrease as they become more expensive to our trading partners, therefore decreasing aggregate demand. That's the second mark, the AD effects. So 1 mark there. This will then send a signal to producers to decrease production and therefore decrease the rate of economic growth. That's half your economic growth mark. However, an appreciated exchange rate can decrease the cost of production for businesses who use imports as factors of production. This would incentivize businesses to increase production and therefore increase aggregate supply. So there's your second mark for the AS stuff. Mark for AS stuff overall, and increase economic growth, finalizing your mark in that area. So that covers both aggregate demand, aggregate supply, multiple effects, covers that analyze part because you're looking at the different parts in really specific features overall. Sometimes you might get a question that says, rather than an appreciation, it might say a change in the exchange rate, in which case your 2 factors could just be an appreciation and a depreciation, and you could go AD or AS. So be really careful, but with analyze, you're looking at multiple effects. Multiple effects on AD, not really great if you're just looking at an appreciation. Now for our final sample question. So with reference to one contemporary example, outline how the government uses budgetary policy to achieve the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. So this is kind of like loosely tying into Unit 4 stuff, but still a question you could realistically be asked now based on the fact that in your classes you would have had to look at budgetary policy and how the government uses budgetary policy to try and achieve economic growth. And realistically, I'd be expecting students to start to think more about contemporary examples they can use so it's less stressful later in the year. So 1 mark is going to come from the contemporary example, describing it. So contemporary example. And I'm going to use one that I'm going to use all the time because it's really easy to use. Then 1 mark's going to be that impacts on AD, so those components and AD overall. And then 1 mark about achievement of strong sustainable economic growth, so SSEG. So defining that goal and saying if we're more or less likely to achieve it. So it's a lot to do for one question, but we'll get into what you can talk about there. So getting to our sample answer, one recent budgetary policy used to attempt to achieve the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, which to define it, I like to include my definition in brackets in the middle because I feel like it fits in a lot easier. It's the highest growth rate possible without causing unnecessary inflationary, environmental, or external pressure, measured at a rate of 3 to 3.5% GDP growth per annum. So you need to include that, otherwise you're probably going to lose a mark. Is the Jobseeker welfare payment. So I really recommend using this one as an AD policy all throughout the year because it's really easy to describe. So this is used to limit the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, tying it into that contemporary stuff. So these Jobseeker payments originally doubled the value of welfare paid to job seekers and unemployed households, so they'd be more able to satisfy their needs and wants. This increased welfare income leads to an increase in private consumption spending and therefore an increase in aggregate demand. So that's linking it to the components of AD there. Really clearly, once again, making sure you use things like private consumption spending and the overall impact in AD. This increase in AD then sends a signal for producers, once again, to say how it affects businesses, to increase their production and therefore increases the rate of economic growth, making it more likely that the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth is achieved. I like to use more likely and less likely in these kind of answers because you can't say for sure until the data comes out if we have or have not achieved it. And at the moment, we are not achieving the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. Also, we're not expecting to based on the situation, but just saying more likely and less likely says the direction that it should be aiming to move us in. All right, so that is some examples of how to structure these questions, answers to questions in this area study. So as always, thank you for watching this random end of video stuff. Feel free to go and visit my website, which is listed like up here, like in that general direction over there, therunningeconomy.com. Join on Discord. Students are starting to help each other. There's like over 60 kids on there now. Subscribe to the YouTube thing because there's like 307 people apparently who watch, probably don't watch it, but subscribe to watch these videos on YouTube, which is bizarre for such a niche content. Any questions at all, feel free to email me, all that normal stuff. Other than that, have a wonderful day and I will see you next time. Goodbye.